There's a moment, and if you've ever stood close enough to real power, you'll know what I mean, where the air changes. It's not something you can explain properly. It's not the smell of the place, though Buckingham Palace has its own particular quality: cold stone, fresh-cut grass from the gardens, and something else underneath, something older. It's not the sounds either, though those are striking enough: the crunch of boots on gravel, the distant rumble of London traffic held at bay like it knows better than to intrude. It's something in the stillness. And on that Tuesday morning in late spring, cool, overcast, with a thin line of gold pressing through the clouds above the Victoria Memorial, I felt that change in the air about 30 seconds before everything else happened. I need to back up. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was there. I've been credentialed press for the diplomatic visit, one of those assignments you accept partly because it sounds prestigious and partly because you're genuinely curious what these events look like up close. Most of what happens in official state diplomacy is theater, and I say that without cynicism. Theater has its place. It communicates things that words can't: the careful handshake, the measured smile, the exact angle of a bow. But sometimes the theater goes wrong. And when it goes wrong in front of cameras, in front of a crowd, in front of 2 nations' worth of national pride, it goes wrong in a way that nobody forgets. The visit had been arranged with the kind of precision that only comes from weeks of back-channel negotiation. The U.S. delegation was in London for a broader diplomatic engagement: trade discussions, security frameworks, the usual architecture of modern alliances, and a ceremonial stop at Buckingham Palace had been worked into the schedule. These things are always worked in. They're meaningful, not just symbolically, but practically. A photograph on the steps of the palace carries weight. It signals partnership. It signals respect. The British side had prepared accordingly. I arrived at the press staging area at 7:30 in the morning. There were maybe 40 journalists already there: British outlets, American wire services, a few European cameras. Everyone was caffeinated, slightly cold, and in that particular mood that journalists get before a set-piece event. Alert but bored, ready to observe but already composing the story they expect to write. The delegation was due at 10. In the meantime, we watched the preparations. The household cavalry had been positioned since before dawn. The King's Guard specifically, a detachment from the Coldstream Guards on that particular morning, were already at their posts. If you've never seen a Coldstream Guard up close, standing post outside a royal residence, it's a different experience from seeing photographs. The photographs make them look theatrical, ceremonial, like props in a tourist attraction. In person, they look like something else entirely. The uniform is part of it, obviously: the scarlet tunic, the black bearskin cap, the white belts and polished buttons. But it's the stillness that gets you. They stand in a way that most people never stand in their entire lives. Not rigid exactly. Rigidity implies effort, implies fighting against the body's natural impulse to shift, to fidget, to move. These men have moved past that. They've trained so long and so deeply that the stillness is just how they are. It's their resting state. I watched one of the guards on the left side of the forecourt for maybe 20 minutes that morning, and I saw him blink 3 times. That's it. 3 blinks in 20 minutes. His name, I found out later through colleagues, was Corporal Daniel Reeves. I'll use his name now because by the end of this story, it's a name worth knowing. The American delegation arrived 8 minutes ahead of schedule, which is itself unusual enough to note. Official delegations are almost always exactly on time or fractionally late. Arriving early suggests either poor timing management or impatience. I didn't know which it was in this case. The motorcade came in from the mall, 3 black vehicles, British police outriders, a subtle but unmistakable American security presence around the perimeter. I recognized the configuration from other similar events. Standard protective detail. J.D. Vance stepped out of the second vehicle. I want to be careful here about describing what I saw, because what happened in the next few minutes got reported in about 16 different ways by 16 different outlets, and most of those reports were either incomplete or shaped by the political sympathies of whoever was writing them. I'm going to try to tell you what I actually observed from where I was standing, which was approximately 40 feet away and slightly elevated on the press risers. Vance was composed. That's the accurate word. He had the ease of a man who had done many official events, who knew the choreography of these things, and who was, at least publicly, in a good mood. He straightened his jacket, exchanged a brief word with someone from his team, and then began moving toward the formal greeting area. The British hosts were there, a senior aide from the Foreign Office, two palace officials whose roles I couldn't identify from my position, and a small welcoming party positioned near the main entrance. What Vance did next was, and I want to be precise, not unreasonable by any ordinary human standard. He moved slightly off the arranged path. Not dramatically, not provocatively. He simply deviated from the exact line of the prescribed route and walked toward the nearest guardsman on the forecourt. He extended his hand. He was smiling. It was, by every external measure, a friendly gesture. A human gesture. The kind of thing you do when you walk into a room and you see someone standing near the door, you say hello, you put out your hand. Corporal Daniel Reeves did not take that hand. He did not look at it. He did not acknowledge it. His eyes remained fixed at precisely the point on the middle distance that they had been fixed at for the previous hour and a half. His right arm, which held his SA-80 rifle at rest, did not move. His left arm remained at his side. His face, what was visible of it beneath the bearskin, showed nothing. Not hostility, not embarrassment, not apology. Just the same absolute, impenetrable stillness. For about 3 seconds, Vance's hand was extended in the air between them, and Corporal Reeves simply wasn't there. Not in any way that mattered. The hand might as well have been reaching toward a pillar. Then Vance withdrew his hand, smiled in a slightly different way, the way you smile when you're recalibrating, and continued toward the formal greeting party. Those 3 seconds. I've thought about them many times since. I've talked to people who were in that forecourt, people who were at different press positions, people who were inside the delegation itself. Everyone remembers those 3 seconds differently. That's how you know a moment was real, when everyone who saw it has a slightly different version, each of them convinced their version is accurate. The version I remember is this. It was not dramatic. It did not feel in real time like a confrontation or a rejection or an embarrassment. It felt like a miscommunication, the kind that happens when one person doesn't understand the rules of a room they've just walked into. But the cameras caught it. Of course they did. And the cameras, unlike human memory, don't recalibrate in real time. They just record what happens. And what they recorded, what you can still find if you look, is a senior American official extending his hand to a British Royal Guard, and the British Royal Guard standing there as though the American official simply did not exist. That footage, about 6 seconds in total, though the critical 3 seconds are the ones that circulate, went out on the wire services within the hour. By afternoon, it was everywhere. I want to talk about what the guard was actually doing. Not in a dry, explanatory way, though the explanation matters and I'll get to it, but in terms of what it looked like from the inside, because I later had the chance to speak with someone who had served in the same regiment and done the same duty, and what he told me changed how I understood those 3 seconds entirely. You don't see them, he told me. We were having coffee near Waterloo a couple of weeks after the incident. He was out of uniform in a jacket and jeans, and he laughed a little when he said it, like he knew how strange it sounded. That's not quite right. You see them, you're aware of them, but you're not engaging with them. They're not part of what's happening. What's happening is you standing at your post, fulfilling your duty. Everything outside that is like weather. It's there. You're aware of it, but you don't interact with it. I asked him if he'd ever had the impulse to break, to respond to someone who was being particularly insistent or particularly intrusive, or, in a situation like this one, particularly high profile. He thought about it for a moment. The impulse isn't the point, he said. By the time you've done the training, by the time you've stood enough hours, the impulse doesn't really arrive in the way you'd expect. It's not like you're fighting an urge to shake someone's hand. It's more that the option isn't on the table. Someone asking you to respond doesn't make responding an option. The post is the option. The post is the only option. I've thought about that conversation a lot. The post is the only option. What happened in the immediate aftermath of the moment was, in some ways, more revealing than the moment itself. The formal greeting proceeded without incident. Vance shook hands with the appropriate officials. Photographs were taken. The diplomatic choreography resumed on its correct lines. On the surface, everything continued as planned. But within the delegation, the temperature had shifted. I heard this from 2 separate sources, one British, one American, who were in positions to observe the delegation's internal dynamics during the subsequent events of the morning. The American side was flustered. Not outraged, not angry in any visible way, but flustered in the way that people get when something unexpected has happened, and they haven't yet figured out what it means or how to respond to it. There were apparently brief consultations. Someone pulled someone else aside. Someone spoke quietly into an earpiece. The British officials, for their part, were entirely composed, which is its own kind of commentary. I spoke to one of the British officials later, off the record, and his description of those consultations was delivered with the kind of measured understatement that the British use when they're trying very hard not to be amused. There was some discussion, he said, about what protocol had been breached. He paused. The answer, of course, was that no protocol had been breached at all. That's the part of the story that doesn't always make it into the 6-second clip. The corporal had done exactly what he was supposed to do. Exactly, precisely, without deviation or error, what the role of ceremonial sentry at a royal residence requires. There is no protocol by which a sentry breaks position to greet a foreign dignitary. There is no version of the duty in which the soldier's stillness becomes optional because someone prominent has arrived. In fact, and this is important, the opposite is true. The higher profile the occasion, the more strictly the sentry maintains position, not because of stubbornness, not because of political sentiment. Because the whole point of the ceremonial duty, the reason it exists, the reason it has existed for centuries, is that it is unconditional. The guard doesn't decide who is worth guarding and who isn't. The guard doesn't decide who merits acknowledgement and who doesn't. The guard stands, for everyone, regardless. That's not a small thing. I've been in rooms with powerful people for most of my professional life, and I can tell you that one of the things power does, one of the things it does almost without exception, is make the powerful expect acknowledgement. It's not vanity, exactly. It's more fundamental than that. When you move through the world and the world consistently responds to your presence, when doors open for you, when people turn toward you, when rooms reorganize themselves around your arrival, you begin, without necessarily meaning to treat that responsiveness as a form of reality, as just how things are. And then you extend your hand to a Coldstream guard. And the world doesn't respond. And for 3 seconds, you discover something interesting about the nature of acknowledgement. By midday, the interpretations were already proliferating. The American right-wing media ran with deliberate snub. The British press was more measured, with most outlets correctly explaining that the guard had done nothing unusual, but several noting the visual starkness of the moment with what I can only describe as quiet satisfaction. International outlets framed it as a cultural moment, a collision between American informality and British ceremonial tradition. None of those frames were entirely wrong. None of them were entirely right either. What happened in that forecourt was simpler and more interesting than any of the frames suggested. A man who occupied enormous political power in the world's most powerful nation reached out his hand, and a corporal who occupied a very specific and ancient role in a very specific tradition simply wasn't available to take it. Not because of politics. Not because of diplomacy. Because the corporal's job, his whole job at that moment, was to be something other than a person you could casually greet. Something more in a particular sense, and something less in another. A symbol, a post, a point of national continuity standing in front of a palace gate. I went back to the palace the following morning. I didn't have credentials that day. I went as a civilian, which is to say I went as what most people are most of the time, a person standing on a pavement watching the guards on the other side of the fence. There were tourists with cameras, a school group, a couple arguing quietly in what sounded like Dutch, the usual texture of a London morning. The guard on the right side of the forecourt that day was not Corporal Reeves. I don't know where he was posted, or whether he even knew that the footage had been viewed millions of times by then. I watched the guard for a while. A child pressed up against the railings and waved. The guard did not wave back. A man held his phone up and took a video. The guard did not look at the phone. A woman called out something cheerful. I couldn't hear exactly what, and the guard did not respond. None of those people were embarrassed. They laughed or shrugged, or took their photos and moved on. Because they understood intuitively that this was the deal. This was the arrangement. You look and the guard does not look back. That's the whole thing. That's the point. The embarrassment only arrives when you've forgotten, or never quite accepted, that the arrangement applies to you too. I filed my piece that evening. My editor wanted the clip description, the political angle, the reaction quotes. I gave him what he needed. But the sentence I kept coming back to, the one I rewrote about 11 times before I finally left it alone, was about those 3 seconds in the forecourt, about the extended hand, about the absolute absence of response. There's a kind of dignity in being ignored by something ancient, I wrote eventually. Not the dignity of being dismissed, something quieter than that. The dignity of being reminded that some things were here long before you arrived, and will be here long after you leave, and that in the presence of those things, the ordinary rules about who gets acknowledged simply don't apply. I don't know if I got that exactly right, but I think I got it close. The thing nobody mentioned in any of the coverage, not the British outlets, not the American ones, not the international press that picked up the clip and ran it in 14 different languages, was the sound. Or rather, the absence of it. Because in the video, there's no audio that captures what the forecourt actually sounded like in those 3 seconds. What you see is the gesture, the stillness, the withdrawal. What you don't hear is how quiet that space was. How the ambient noise of London, the traffic on the Mall, the distant horns, the pigeons, the low mechanical hum that every major city generates constantly, like a pulse, seemed to pull back slightly in that moment. I noticed it at the time. I didn't note it immediately because I was watching, not listening, and because it seemed almost impossible that the sound had actually changed. But when I spoke to a photographer who was positioned closer than me, maybe 20 feet from the guard post, on a slightly different angle, she mentioned it without prompting. It went quiet, she said. Not completely, but quieter, like the city held its breath. I believed her, I'd felt it too. I want to spend some time with Corporal Reeves. Not in a biographical sense. I don't have access to his full service record and wouldn't publish it if I did. But in the sense of understanding what kind of person ends up standing in a forecourt in ceremonial uniform, immovable, on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Because there's a thing that people outside military service consistently misunderstand about the ceremonial role. They see the bearskin and the scarlet and they think pageant. They think tourism. They think it must be, on some level, not entirely serious, a performance put on for the benefit of visitors and television cameras, filled by men who perhaps aren't quite what you'd call soldiers in the full sense. That understanding is wrong in almost every particular. The soldiers who stand ceremonial guard at Buckingham Palace are fully operational military personnel. The Coldstream Guards, the regiment on duty that morning, have been operational in every major British military engagement since the 17th century. Many of the men who stand those posts have served in operational theaters. Some of them have been in firefights. Some of them have been under mortar fire. Some of them have carried colleagues out of situations that would make that cold spring morning in the palace forecourt look like a quiet afternoon in a library. And then they come back, and they put on the uniform, and they stand the post. The ceremonial duty isn't a reward for good behavior, or a gentle assignment for soldiers who can't handle the real thing. It's a specific, demanding, disciplined role, one that requires a particular kind of mental endurance that is different from combat endurance, but not less than it. Standing completely still for 90 minutes in public view, with cameras and crowds and the full apparatus of international attention on you, responding to nothing, that's a trained capacity. It takes as long to develop as marksmanship. I learned more about the specific training from a retired officer I spoke with several weeks after the incident. He'd served 3 decades, most of it in the Guards, and he was the kind of man who expressed himself with great precision and slightly longer pauses than most people use. The training for ceremonial duty, he said, is not about suppression. That's the misunderstanding. People think we train soldiers to suppress their reactions, to fight down the impulse to move, to speak, to respond. That's not how it works. What you're actually training is a different relationship to the environment. The soldier on post isn't ignoring the people outside the railing. He's occupying a different category of reality from them. I asked him to explain that. He thought about it. You know how, if you're a doctor, a patient's symptoms are information rather than distress signals? Or if you're a pilot, turbulence is data rather than cause for panic. It's a professional recategorization of the same event. The people outside the railing are real people. The soldier is aware of them. But they're in the category of things that are happening in the environment rather than things I need to respond to, like weather. Like weather, I repeated. I'd heard that word before. Exactly, you note it. You're aware of it. You don't interact with it. The U.S. delegation's schedule continued through the morning. There were formal meetings inside the palace. Nothing I had access to as press. Nothing that filtered out through official channels with any particular texture. The standard statement afterward mentioned warm and productive discussions and reaffirmed commitment to the transatlantic alliance, and several other phrases that could have been generated by any diplomatic occasion from the last 30 years. But outside, in the periphery of the official day, things were more interesting. I picked up, through conversations with two members of the wider American delegation's support staff, people who handle logistics, scheduling, communications, that the hand refusal had generated more internal discussion than the official stoicism suggested. Not outrage. I want to be clear about that. Nobody in the delegation was characterizing it as an insult or a deliberate provocation, at least not in any conversation that filtered through to me. The British officials had explained, promptly and professionally, that the guards were not able to break position during ceremonial duty, and that explanation had been formally accepted. But there's a difference between formally accepting an explanation and emotionally processing the moment. What I heard, and this is impressionistic, based on fragments of overheard conversation and second-hand reporting from people I trust, was that the delegation was working through something like recalibration, a kind of quiet reassessment that happens when a situation unfolds differently from how it was scripted. One person I spoke to described it plainly. There was definitely a moment when people weren't sure what to do. You plan for a lot of things on a trip like this. You don't really plan for the host country's military standing completely still while your principal is extending a greeting. The press corps, meanwhile, was doing what press corps do. By mid-morning, the clip was everywhere, and the interpretations were accelerating. I watched them in real time on my phone between the scheduled press moments, each new headline adding another layer of meaning to 3 seconds of footage that the guard himself had probably not thought about since it happened. British royalist, a masterclass in discipline. American tabloid, snubbed, VIP left hanging by stone-faced palace soldier. European news aggregator, cultural divide on display as U.S. officials gesture meets royal protocol wall. Twitter X, thousands of comments, split roughly along predictable lines, with the interesting contribution of several retired British soldiers and veterans explaining, quite patiently and with decreasing patience as the thread continued, that the guard had done exactly the right thing and that no offense had been committed or intended. Those explanations were mostly ignored. The clip was too clean, too perfectly shaped for its purpose, whatever purpose you wanted to give it. If you wanted to read it as a snub, it looked like a snub. If you wanted to read it as a cultural lesson, it looked like a cultural lesson. If you wanted to read it as British quiet superiority, or American obliviousness, or diplomatic awkwardness, or any of a dozen other stories, the 6 seconds would hold the weight of whatever you brought to it. That's how you know an image has escaped its context. I spent part of the afternoon near the Victoria Memorial. This is a habit of mine when I'm covering London events. I find a place nearby where civilians are going about their ordinary day, and I spend some time there, letting the contrast between the official event and the ordinary world recalibrate my sense of proportion. It usually helps. The memorial sits at the end of the mall, directly across from the palace forecourt where the morning's incident had occurred. It's an enormous white marble structure, Victoria enthroned at the top, allegories of various virtues arranged below, the whole thing slightly overwhelming in the way that Victorian monuments tend to be. Tourists circle it, take photographs, sit on the steps. Pigeons, squirrels, the full London tourist ecosystem. I sat on the steps for a while and watched people watching the palace. An older American couple nearby had their phones out and were filming the changing of the guard, or what they thought was the changing, though the timing wasn't quite right. They were narrating to each other in the way that couples do when they've been together long enough that the narration is more habit than communication. "Do you think they blink?" the woman said. "I don't know," the man said. "They must blink. They must, yeah." They kept filming anyway. I thought about Corporal Reeves, about the 30 years of military tradition behind him, About the 6 seconds of footage that were, at that moment, being captioned in German, French, Mandarin, and Portuguese. About the extended hand and the unmoved face and the particular quality of that silence. About what it means to be really, deeply still in a world that never stops expecting you to respond. There's a protocol note that never quite made it into the mainstream coverage, partly because it requires some background to make sense. The role of the household division ceremonial guards, the specific category of duty Corporal Reeves was performing that morning, carries a formal designation that dates to a period well before anything like modern diplomacy existed in its current form. The duties, the comportment, the rules of engagement for the post. They were codified in eras when the relationship between a standing guard and a visiting dignitary was understood by everyone present. The guard was not a greeter. The guard was not a host. The guard was a sovereign's representative, physically embodied at a point of access, whose stillness was itself a statement about the nature of what he was guarding. Over the centuries, the context around that role changed enormously. The politics, the global relationships, the nature of diplomacy itself, all transformed. The role didn't transform. It persisted intact through the changes, because the persistence is the whole point. A tradition that bends for circumstance isn't tradition. It's just a preference that hasn't been challenged yet. What makes the Coldstream Guard's ceremonial discipline meaningful, what makes it something beyond theater, is that it doesn't bend. For tourists with cameras, for politicians who wander off route, for senior foreign officials with extended hands. The post is the post. That evening, the delegation attended a formal dinner. I wasn't present for that, but colleagues who were described it as warm and smooth. The morning's awkward moment apparently dissolved into the general flow of the day, which is usually how these things go. Official events have a gravity of their own. They pull incidents into the background. The photographs from the dinner were all handshakes and smiles. Nobody extended a hand to a ceremonial guard at a dinner, so there were no complications. Everything looked, from the outside, exactly as it was supposed to look. But I kept thinking about the morning. I kept thinking about those 3 seconds, and about something the retired officer had said to me that I hadn't included in my main piece because I didn't know quite what to do with it. He'd said it near the end of our conversation, almost as an afterthought, the way people sometimes save the most important thing for the moment they're standing up to leave. The interesting thing, he said, isn't that the guard didn't shake his hand. The interesting thing is what it means that people found it surprising. We've had ceremonial guards at those posts for 300 years. The rules haven't changed. What's changed is the expectation, the assumption that everyone will respond, that acknowledgement is owed, that the world will reorganize itself for whoever is prominent enough to ask it to. He paused. 3 seconds of a guard standing still, and people are writing articles. That tells you something. He didn't say what it told him. He just nodded and put on his coat and left. I walked back to my hotel that night along the embankment, which I always find clearing. The Thames at night has a particular quality, the lights on the far bank, the dark water, the bridges in both directions. It feels old and continuous in a way that the city's busier parts don't quite manage. I thought about the delegation, already in the air or getting there. About the footage, still circulating. About Corporal Reeves, presumably back in barracks, presumably unaware of or indifferent to the scale of attention that 3 seconds of his ordinary duty had generated. I thought about the extended hand. I thought about what it takes to hold a position when the world is asking you to break it. And I thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that the most interesting people in any official event are rarely the officials. About 10 days after the event, I got a letter. Not an email. An actual letter written by hand on plain white paper, postmarked from a part of London I recognized as residential, not far from a barracks, though I won't be more specific than that. The handwriting was clear and angular, the kind you develop when you've filled out a lot of official forms and learned to write in conditions where legibility matters more than style. It was from someone who identified themselves only as having served in a similar capacity. They'd seen my piece. They had something to add. I met them 3 days later in a coffee shop near Vauxhall. The kind of place where nothing much happens and nobody much notices you, which is, I suspect, why they chose it. We sat in a corner booth with 2 cups of tea, and they told me things that changed how I understood the whole morning. I'll call them W, that's not their initial. It's just a letter. W had done ceremonial duty at the palace over a period of 3 years, with postings to other royal residences in between. They'd done hundreds of guard rotations. They'd stood in rain, in summer heat, in cold that made their eyes water. They'd stood through protests and celebrations and state visits and ordinary Tuesday mornings that nobody would ever photograph or remember. The thing that people outside don't understand, W said, wrapping both hands around their tea, is that you do feel everything. That's the misconception. People think we're trained to feel nothing, like we've been switched off. But you feel everything. You feel the cold. You feel when someone is standing very close to the railing and making a lot of noise. You feel when something unusual is happening in the crowd. You just don't show it. You just don't show it, W agreed. And you don't act on it, but the feeling is there. You're completely present. You're not absent. You're more present, actually. You have to be. Your situational awareness has to be perfect because your job isn't just to stand still. Your job is to stand still while also watching, processing, deciding whether what's happening in your environment requires a response that overrides the position. I asked what kinds of things overrode the position. W was quiet for a moment. Real threats, they said. Not discomfort, not embarrassment, not someone being loud or close or making a gesture you weren't expecting. Real physical threats to the person or property you're guarding. Then the ceremonial role disappears and the soldier is there. They paused. Everything else, everything that isn't that, you absorb. It goes in, you register it, and then it goes somewhere else, somewhere you don't look at while you're on post. You look at it later if you need to. Or you don't. W told me about a previous occasion, not an incident they wanted me to report in detail, just a context they wanted me to understand, when a member of a foreign delegation had done something similar. Not an extended hand, but a deliberate attempt to engage the guard, speaking to them, stepping closer than the proper distance, at one point actually touching the guard's arm. What did the guard do? I asked. Nothing, W said. He stood. And the delegation member eventually stopped, looked a bit confused, moved on. W looked at me. The thing is, and I don't think this was in any of the coverage because it doesn't fit the narrative of either side, the guard told me afterward that his strongest feeling during the whole thing wasn't irritation, or offense, or even concentration. It was something closer to pity, not the condescending kind, just a kind of sadness on behalf of someone who didn't know the rules of the room they were in. That landed differently than I expected. I thought about that word, pity, not contempt, not satisfaction, not professional pride, something quieter and more human than any of those. The coverage, by that point, had mostly moved on. The clip had completed its life cycle. Viral moment, think piece phase, hot take exhaustion, gentle fade. Other things had happened. Other images had circulated. The 6 seconds in the palace forecourt had been absorbed into the background noise of a news cycle that moves faster than any single moment can sustain. But something had crystallized for me in the weeks since, something I wanted to try to articulate, because I think it's more interesting than the political interpretations that had dominated the immediate response. What happened in that forecourt wasn't about politics. It wasn't fundamentally about America and Britain, or about any specific political figure, or about ceremony versus informality, or even about the specific rules of ceremonial guard duty. It was about something more elemental, the collision between two entirely different understandings of what a human being is for. One understanding, the one that leads a person to extend their hand in a gesture of greeting toward a ceremonial guard, is essentially democratic. It assumes that people are fundamentally equal, that the ordinary human transaction of acknowledgement is available to everyone, that rank or role doesn't exempt you from the basic expectation of social response. In this worldview, refusing to shake a hand isn't discipline, it's rudeness. And the fact that I'm powerful enough to have my rudeness explained and excused doesn't make it less rude. It's an understandable worldview. In many contexts, it's the correct one. The other understanding, the one that puts a soldier in a scarlet tunic and a bearskin hat and tells him to stand at that post and be nothing but the post, is older. It doesn't assume equality in that way. It assumes that some roles, some functions, some duties are so important to the collective that they supersede the individual entirely, that the person in the role isn't the point. The role is the point. And the role's integrity, its unconditional, uncompromising, non-negotiable persistence, is what makes it meaningful. Neither of these worldviews is simply wrong. But they don't speak the same language. And when they collide in a forecourt, in front of cameras, in 3 seconds of footage that gets watched millions of times, the collision is disorienting for both sides. I went back to the palace a third time. I know I couldn't stop. This time I stayed for almost 2 hours. I watched the tourist rhythm of the place, the waves of visitors arriving from the mall, pressing against the railings, taking their photographs, moving on. I watched the guards cycle, the slow, precise march when the position changed, the new guard settling into stillness, the old one departing with the same measured pace. I watched faces in the crowd, people of probably 30 different nationalities, ages ranging from toddlers to elderly, the full human variety. Most of them were taking photographs or trying to get the guard to respond to them, waves, shouts, silly faces. None of it worked. None of it was expected to work. And here's the thing I noticed, watching all of it. Everyone was smiling. Not because they'd gotten a response. They hadn't. They weren't going to. They knew they weren't going to. They were smiling because there was something satisfying, something weirdly, genuinely satisfying about being ignored by something that immovable. Like it was actually a relief. Like in a world that spends every waking moment demanding your attention and responding to yours, encountering something that simply wouldn't respond was restful, was interesting, was, in its own strange way, beautiful. A child pressed her palm flat against the railing and studied the guard with the serious, undistracted attention that very young children sometimes bring to things that adults have already half decided how to see. She wasn't trying to get him to respond. She was just looking. I thought about what W had said, about the guard who felt something like pity for the person who didn't know the rules of the room, about how the feeling wasn't contempt, wasn't triumph or superiority or satisfaction at someone powerful being leveled. Just sadness on behalf of someone who'd walked into a kind of reality they weren't equipped to navigate. There's a version of that morning's incident that's about embarrassment, the word in the title, the word in the coverage, the frame that made it most shareable. An American official embarrassed in front of cameras. A delegation caught off guard. A moment that didn't go as scripted. And there's another version, quieter, less shareable, more true, that's about something different. About what happens when the ordinary mechanisms of power and acknowledgement encounter something that predates them. Something that was built, deliberately and over centuries, to be unaffected by those mechanisms. Not as an insult to any individual. As a structural commitment to the idea that some things stand regardless. Corporal Daniel Reeves went back to his duties. The delegation flew home. The clip circulates still in the background of the internet, one of those artifacts that gets rediscovered periodically, reshared, recontextualized, used as evidence for whatever argument someone is currently making. The guard and the hand and the 3 seconds. I don't know if Reeves ever saw the coverage. I don't know what he makes of those 3 seconds being watched by millions of people while he was simply doing what he'd been trained to do. Maybe nothing. Maybe, in the tradition of his regiment, he holds that question somewhere he doesn't look at while he's on post. W told me at the end of our conversation in the coffee shop near Vauxhall that they still dreamed about the palace sometimes. Not in a way that disturbed them, just that it appeared, the forecourt and the railings and the sounds of the city held at arm's length. They were standing at the post. Nothing unusual was happening. Is that a good dream? I asked. W considered. It's a clear one, they said. Everything is exactly what it is. Nothing is asking to be anything else. There's something peaceful about that. They picked up their tea. I miss it, actually. The Victoria Memorial, if you look at it from a certain angle in the early morning, catches the light in a way that makes the marble almost warm. Not quite white. Something between white and gold, depending on the clouds. The allegories on the lower tiers, truth, justice, motherhood, look different in that light. Less like symbols and more like people caught in the middle of something. I stood there on my last morning before I left London and watched the light change across the palace facade. The guards were at their posts. The tourists were beginning to arrive, the first of the day's many waves. Someone was already trying to get a guard to smile. The guard didn't smile. The city breathed around them both, traffic, pigeons, the river a few minutes' walk away. The whole enormous ordinary apparatus of a city going about its business. And in the middle of it, that stillness. That complete, trained, centuries deep, utterly unbothered stillness. Not ignoring the world. Just declining to be moved by it. There's no tidy lesson to take from a Tuesday morning in a palace forecourt. No clean resolution, no simple moral, no obvious side to come down on. Corporal Reeves didn't do anything wrong. The official who extended his hand didn't do anything wrong, or at least, nothing more wrong than misunderstanding the rules of a room. The footage circulated because it was striking, and it was striking because it contained, in concentrated form, a collision of two genuine ways of being in the world. What I take from it, and this is only mine, only one reporter's sense of it, worth exactly what that's worth, is something about the value of things that don't bend. Not rigidity for its own sake, not stubbornness, not the refusal to adapt or evolve, but the specific, valuable, quietly radical act of maintaining a position when everything around you is asking you to abandon it. Holding a post because the post matters. Being unmoved not because you feel nothing, but because you've decided, or been trained to decide, which over time becomes the same thing, that being moved isn't what you're for. In a world that measures status partly by how much response you can command, there is something humbling and clarifying about an encounter with something that simply doesn't operate by those rules. The guard stood. The hand was extended. The city breathed. And 3 seconds of disciplined stillness said more about duty, identity, and the nature of tradition than any official statement or diplomatic communique that morning managed to convey. The post is the only option. That's the whole story,